Excellent. So before I start talking about your photographic style, I would like to thank Topaz Labs and Darcy and all of the people that work on this to put this together for us, because it really is an awesome platform for us to learn from each other, and really working with them has been awesome and always is. So with that being said, I'm going to open it up and talk about your photographic style and how exactly you find your photographic style and when that photographic style happens. So what is a photographic style? It's not the gear that you own. It's not the software that you own. Those are just tools. Those are tools that just kind of help you get to the point that you're trying to get to. It's how you use those tools to create photos that define your work as yours. That is your photographic style. That's how you create your photographic style. Everyone has a different style because it's unique to them. Typically, when we hear the word style, we usually think of a painter like Van Gogh. Ironically, we have Impression that just came out, so this webinar was perfect for this topic. But Van Gogh, Da Vinci, they all had a definitive style that as soon as you saw it, you knew exactly whose it was. So if you've ever said, I wish my photos looked like blank or blanks, like I wish my photos looked like this great photographers, and I had said that in the past before too, but really I don't want you to wish those things, because if you do that, they're only going to hinder your personal photographic style. They're just going to be a hindrance as to what you can do and how you can become, because your photographic style is unique to you and only you. Okay? Now, here's proof. On Everyday HDR, I used to do something called a concert. It was an HDR concert where we'd come together. I'd give one project with one image or a series of brackets, and we'd come together and we would work on them on our own, and then at the very end of it, they would all come together on one blog post. So the idea was simple with this project. This is a one exposure value image. I wanted them to turn it into an HDR photograph. So make it look HDR from a single photograph. I had people submitting from all over the world. Everyone was different. Nobody had seen anybody's work, and this is one of them that came in from Tim Purcell. Here's another one that came in from Jeff McDougall. You see here, each one of these has their own definitive style. Steve Rich, another one with his own definitive style, even took out the pen and put in the telescope. Nobody told him to do that. He just decided to do that, and that's perfectly fine because that's what he saw when he looked at this image. That's the important part. Here's another one from Simon Coates. Clearly different than the last image. And then Nick Marzinski, a little bit over the edge, did this really kind of edgy, the ink blot thing coming across the screen, because that's what his vision was when he saw it. That was his photographic style coming through, and then I had mine in there as well. Now I added some things too, kind of seamlessly into it to try and make my style come out in that photo. See, your photographic style is not developed overnight, and it's not developed by wishing that you had somebody else's style. Okay, it's a process. It evolves over time. But I'm going to tell you the secret to this. So how do you know when your style is being developed? And that you will know when your style is starting to develop when you see changes in your work and you begin to ask why instead of how. Why do you do that to your photograph instead of how do you do that to your photograph? Once you've figured out all of the hows and you're really starting to dive deep into the whys, that's when you are starting to transform as a photographer and going into the realm of developing your own style. Now, this used to frustrate me to no end when I was in college because I wanted to have a style, and I told my professor, this is my style, and she said, no, you're too young in your artistic career to have a style. It hasn't come out yet, it hasn't evolved yet. And I wanted to tell her to pack sand, but the truth is it hadn't developed yet. It took years for me to develop my photographic style. So like I said before, the tools that you have, the software that you own, the lenses that you own for your camera, the camera that you have, those are simply tools. They will not develop your style. You will develop your style with those tools. So what I'm going to show you in this webinar is how I went from this photograph to this photograph. Now, all of it's going to be done with Topaz Products, and the beauty of it is that I just use all of them as tools to get me to that point. Because if you look at this photograph, it was taken in my basement. I had one flash. This is my 3-year-old son, so I had about, I don't know, 1.5 seconds of time to snap this shot. Otherwise, he was gone. So I really didn't have much time to set up. And you know, I get the outlet in the background. I don't have a backdrop. It looks kind of hideous in the background, but there's a workable photo there. So how do you get it to this? How do you use the tools that you have, understanding the whys, the why you're doing something with that tool to generate your style? Now, over the course of time, I've done several portraits like this that I'm starting to see my own style come through in these portraits. So while I'm showing you stuff that is going to be my style specific, it's going to help you utilize those tools to create your own photographic style. So the first thing I'm going to do is open up the image in Adobe Camera Raw, and it's giving me that error message. Okay, so here we are in Adobe Camera Raw. This is the original photograph straight out of the camera. It's raw. It needs some work. So the first thing I'm going to do is really just go into the exposure and increase that exposure a little bit to get a little bit more brightness in the photo. Now I don't want to go a whole stop up because that's way too much. I just want to go about 1/3 of a stop up. And then I'm going to go into the contrast and increase the contrast a little bit to get a little bit more definition between light and dark. Then I'm going to go into the highlights and see what happens when I boost those highlights a little bit. For the most part, I think I'm going to leave the highlights alone. I'll go into the highlights later with other programs. So what I'm really trying to do here, why I'm using this, is I'm using this tool to define the image that's going to go in and get all the work done to it with my other tools in my toolbox here. So going into the shadows, if you see over here, there's a deep shadow over here. What I really wanted to do was put a reflector on this side of them, a gold reflector on this side to make this photo more warm. Now I told you, I was just setting up my lights. I was just setting everything up. I was actually practicing with a new lens that I bought, and I didn't have the time because with a 3-year-old, it's like, boom, okay, sorry, Dad, I'm not doing that again. I'm on to the next thing. So with the shadows, I'm going to increase those shadows a little bit so I can open up the side of his face as if I had used a reflector, but I don't actually have a reflector in the image. This is the beauty of RAW. RAW has a lot of extra information in the file that a JPEG would not have. I'm not saying that you wouldn't be able to do that with a JPEG, but this helps me exploit the dynamic range that's in that photo to really pull this information out. So the whites, I'm going to leave them alone, and the blacks, I'm going to bring that up a little bit too so I can really open up a little bit more on that side to make it look like I used a reflector. Now one of the things I'm going to do here is I'm not going to do anything with clarity because I'm going to do that later with Topaz clarity. Instead of a 1 slider, I'm going to use the multitude that are in Topaz clarity. I am going to increase the vibrance because what vibrance does is vibrance is kind of like a when you move vibrance up, it will boost all the colors in the photograph, but try its hardest to protect the skin tones in an image. So it's kind of like a mild saturation increase that tries to avoid the skin tone so that you don't overly saturate skin tones. So with that being said, I'm just going to open up my image. And the first thing I need to do is get him off of this background because it's hideous. Okay, so I'm going to go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and Remask. And the reason why I could use many other ways, and here's the thing, we're going to talk more about the whys than the hows. How to remove him from the background. I could use many things to remove him from the background, but why am I using Topaz Remask? Because it's quick, it's simple, and I like how I guess user-friendly it is the nice way to put it. I usually call it dummy-proof, but it's very user-friendly. I'm just going to trace with blue around areas that are going to be difficult. Once I get done tracing that blue around there, I'm just going to go ahead and press the red fill in that background, and compute mask. So it's going to do all this great work for me, but the thing it's going to miss out here is if you ever zoom in a little bit, I'll just go ahead to the zoom, and you see here, I'm pressing spacebar. Spacebar will turn my fill tool into a hand so I can move around the image. It's a very useful tool, so you don't have to keep going back and forth between your tools. So if you ever see like a lightish gray in areas that you selected and you don't want that, it's okay. It's just during the mask computation, it pulled more than it needed. So if you just go to the keep brush, make it a little bit smaller, and then just click on those areas, not all the way out here because then it's going to keep area out there. You just want to click in areas that are inside that depth so that it only pulls the stuff inside the white area. If you accidentally grab too much from the outside, just press the X magic brush or the red magic brush to not accept that. Now over here on this side of the shoulder, we have quite a bit that came through with that mask. So I'm just going to go ahead and go over with green on these areas so that it knows that I want to keep those. Because if I don't, what's going to happen is you're going to see the background through those areas of the photo when I start doing the compositing. So I'm going to go ahead and click the green on these areas too, and the green on these areas too. And I know a lot of people are probably like, just show us impression already, just show us impression already, because I've been thinking about it for the last week, ever since I started playing with it. And I will show you impression, but right now we got to clean this up first. So, okay. So we're going to clean that up and make sure all that stuff is selected. Now we got to go to our keep and our cut to make sure that what we're keeping is exactly what we want. Now if you see here over on the ear a little bit, there's still some of this stuff coming through, so I will just click in those areas to make sure that we're accepting all of that as green. We might have the same problem over here on the shoulder because these were tricky areas. A lot of times you can just go back to the blue brush and just go over that with the blue brush, and it'll usually fix it too, and you can be a little bit more haphazard with that selection, but I like to be pretty meticulous with that green. So then what I'm going to do is in the recovery slider, I'm going to move the recovery slider over a little bit because that will help those areas, those fringing areas around the side of my mask. I usually just kind of go around 48 to 50 with that. And that looks about good for me. I'm not going to do any desaturation with that because if I was shooting on a green screen, a lot of times the green would show through those areas. So that's where I would move the desaturation up. If I move the desaturation up now, it's actually going to start desaturating some of the colors that are within that part that I want to keep. So I'm going to press OK, and now I've got him on his own layer, and it looks pretty good. So I don't really have to do much more with that. So now what I want to do is I want to do some skin softening. And when I do skin softening, I don't like to make things look like they are some kind of cartoonish model or something that belongs in a Maxim magazine, because that kind of stuff is overrated. It's not true to what reality is, and what I'm trying to do here is show the truth and the reality of things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Command or Control J. What that does, if you duplicate a mask that has some of that area that's see that area that didn't quite come through on that mask, even though I was using the green brush on that, if I duplicate that mask, it'll just help fill in those areas without making any other additions to the mask. So that's a good tip too. So I'm going to go to Filter, I'm going to go to Topaz Labs, I'm going to go to Clean 3. I love using Topaz Clean to clean up my my skin in my images. Now looking at this, I can see that there's some other things I need to clean up with the stamp tool, and I'll do that in a second. So what I usually do is I go over here to the skin collection and I start with something like blemish removal, maybe blemish removal strong, to see what that's going to do. And it's okay to actually go a little bit stronger in Topaz Clean than it is to go too mild, and I'll show you that reason in a second. So over here on the right hand side, after we've chosen our preset, it's already got us kind of set up for what I kind of want in my skin cleaning. So if I move the radius and the threshold, you can see that the radius and threshold are pretty much going to work together with the strength to control just how much is coming through, just how much is getting blurred and blended together in that skin. Now, you can use stuff like Gaussian blurs to do this as well, but I found it's not quite as effective as Topaz Clean, because you can see a lot of these, like the baby hair that's on his face is still coming through even after cleaning that up. And that's what I'm talking about with still keeping things true to the nature as if they belonged. Okay. So then you have down here, you have something called texture, and that texture, if you move it all the way down, you can see that that texture is actually doing a lot for us. It's filling in those areas so that we don't get that smooth cartoon look on skin that we shouldn't have to begin with. That texture is really helping us out here in adding areas to the blended area. So those hair-like things that you're seeing on his face, those are actually coming through because of the texture. So with sharpness, if I drop that sharpness down, you can see it's going to make it less sharp in those areas. I do like how sharp that is in some of the areas on the skin, so I'll go ahead and bring that up a little bit. So there's my before and my after. I'm going to go ahead and just press OK on this. I'm going to show you why it's not really too crazy important to make sure that you get everything perfect in Topaz Clean. Now, you obviously want to get it as close to perfection as possible, but here I purposely went overboard so that you can see in Photoshop that if I just drop the opacity of that duplicate layer and just bring that down a little bit, I still get all the benefits of having maybe that full-on clean look, but I can drop it down a little bit so I can bring areas back from my original photograph. So there's the before and there's the after. So I like that. It's a very subtle, clean skin texture. But the other thing here is that there are certain areas on a person that I don't want to be affected by the cleaning. And that is eyes, noses, clothes, hair, and the mouth, because those are all areas that have very fine definition. So if I just make a mask on this and I paint with black, what I'm going to do, not just paint with black with my Wacom tablet here, I'm actually going to press the / key. And what that / key is going to do as I start painting is it's going to show me areas that I'm actually painting in red. So that lets me see exactly what areas are being affected by my masking as I'm doing the masking, because it's a lot easier to see with that red. Now we can always press that / key at any time and remove that red. So I make my brush a little bit smaller and go over his eyes, go over his eyebrows because those have definition of hair in them as well, and go over his eyes also. Okay, and then I'm going to go over his nose a little bit here, just that definition in his nose, and then his lips too. And also his hair, because I don't want that to be affected by what I did with Topaz Clean either. Okay, so now if I turn that / key off, you can see the difference here with that skin definition and the eyes still looking like they should, still looking human and not looking faded like he's in some type of magazine. Now, one of the things here, I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer. And over here, I'm going to select the spot healing brush, make sure it's set to content aware and sample all layers. Now, when I click that little sleepy thing he had in his eye, that'll make that go away, and then I can click any other blemishes and make them go away as well. However, my style is to stay as true to nature as possible, so I only want to clean up things that I find to be distractions and not try and clean up all of his hair, because that hair belongs there. That's the baby hair that defines him. So I'm going to leave that the way it is. Now, what I like to do anytime I'm doing any retouching, at this point, I've got myself to a good retouch. It's decent. I need to go into other things, but I want to keep this stuff all to itself. So I'm going to press I'm going to select all of these layers by pressing and holding Shift, and then press Command-Control-J. That's going to duplicate them. I'm going to take these guys, press Command-Control-G, put them in a group, and hide them. That means that if I ever have to go back to my original work, it's already done. I can also now press Command or Control E on all of these so that everything that I've done here is now all on one layer. The beauty of this is I can also go into this group and select this one by pressing and holding Shift, right-clicking, and linking these layers. What that means is that anytime I move this layer in any part of the composition that I'm doing, and then I remove the visibility eyeball, guess what? It's all still there. So if I did all that work, they still follow each other. So if I messed up this layer, that means I could always go back to my originals and fix anything up because it's already done. It's non-destructive editing in a kind of semi-destructive way, because what I did was I just put all that stuff together, clumped it all together into one layer. So this is my working copy, and this is my history, so that I don't lose any of that. I'm going to turn the visibility eyeball off on that one. So I'm still not going to drop a background in here yet. That's my narrative hook, because my background, I'm going to be using Topaz Impression, and I know you want to see it, so you're going to have to wait. Okay. So now I'm going to go into lens effects. So I'm going to Filter, Topaz Labs, Lens Effects. And what I'm doing with lens effects is there are many ways that you could add some warmth to an image. Like I said before, I wanted to use a gold reflector with this photograph, but I just could not sneak in there. He was too quick. I had my reflector out, but I didn't have it in the arm, so I couldn't get the picture with the reflector. But in Topaz Lens Effects, if you've never seen this before, there's a lot of really cool filters in here that can be used almost to emulate what happens in the process of taking the picture. Like the center focus, selective bokeh, you've got different types of filter like diffusion, graduated color, all filters that you would put on the front of a lens, but then you also have one here that's called filter reflector. So when I open that up, I've got the adjustments over here on the right, and I've got multiple different types here. I've got the golden and I've got silver. So a silver reflector will just give me a whitish color to my image, whereas a gold reflector will give me a gold color to my image. What I'm going to do here is increase the strength to see what I like. Actually, I'm going to increase the strength and decrease the transition to see exactly what angle I want to put this at, so that that reflector goes over to that side more, because the reflector would have been on his right side, and then I'm going to move that position over until it starts to cover that side of his face. Now I can reduce the strength and the transition, so that that gold reflector is really hitting on that right side of the face where it would have been. Maybe decrease the strength just a little bit more, so you can see the difference here. That shadow now has a nice gold tone to it, and I can move that gold reflector any way I please. As far as the whys and the hows, I could have done this with many other ways, but it's just so much easier, and that's why I use Topaz Lens Effects, because I don't have to worry about graduated filters in Photoshop. I don't have to worry about trying to make some kind of gradation to do that. I've got it right here, and I've got it nice and easy and simple for me to work with. So let me go ahead and check that angle again and check that positioning. I like it right there. I'm going to drop that strength a little bit, so we just get a nice little warmth addition with Lens Effects. Press OK. So because this is on my working layer, if I reduce the visibility on that, you'll see that my history is unchanged. All that stuff is unchanged on there. So if I needed to go back for any reason, or if I needed to do some masking on this one, I could do that and still have that historical layer underneath. Maybe I want to change the opacity on that a little bit, I could do that as well. So I'm going to leave that the way it is. And now I'm going to go into Topaz Clarity. I'm going to use Clarity to define some of my colors, and also use it to define some of the contrast that's in the face. So if I go to Filter, Topaz Labs, and Clarity, the thing I love about Clarity is its ability to manipulate contrast in multiple ways. Now, like I said before, you have the Clarity slider in Adobe Camera Raw. It's a very powerful tool to use. However, it's got two settings, more or less. Now, I like the ability to have more or less over 4 settings. So in my micro contrast and my low contrast, medium contrast, I get complete control over that. Now with micro contrast, if I was editing a photo of a man like myself with my goatee and sometimes have my stubble on my face, I would bring the micro contrast up, because it gives me that that grungy look. It makes me look like I should be working. But with children and with women, you typically don't want to go that grungy with the micro contrast, because it makes them look dirty, just like it makes him look dirty here. So I'm going to move that micro contrast down to kind of give me a little bit more smoothing around those edges on that micro contrast level. And then with the low contrast, I can go ahead and move that up to see what I get with moving the low contrast up, move it down to see what I get with moving it down a little bit. I'll keep it right about there. And then we've got our medium contrast. I can move that medium contrast up. You can see the different areas that these affect. Look at the medium contrast affects more of the areas around his eye right there, whereas the low contrast is affecting the more definitive areas there. So it's a very smaller amount. So as you work down, the areas of contrast get larger and larger and larger, micro being the smallest, and then low working its way to high. So then I'm going to go ahead and look at the high contrast and see what happens when I move that up. You see I got a much bigger block of contrast there. I'll move that down just a slight bit. So here's my before, my after. It's a very small refinement of the contrast on the face here, but here is where the great part comes in, because now I've got the hue saturation filter right here in Topaz Clarity. When it comes to color and skin tones, you're typically going to be dealing with 3 different colors: red, orange, and yellow. So if I go into the luminosity, or the luminosity of those individual colors, I can start to bring out those colors even more or less. So here in the reds, you can see his lips and his nose are red. And typically with children and women, that deeper red in the lips, even in men sometimes, that deeper red in the lips really does make the portrait just have a little bit more definition between where the lip starts and where the skin starts, and gives you that definition that you're looking for. It's kind of like a dodging and burning with color. So here, the same thing with orange. I can move the orange up because the orange is predominantly the rest of the face there. So if I move that orange down just a slight tad, you can see I'm kind of doing some dodging and burning strictly within those skin tones. So if I move that down, I start to make those skin tones a little bit deeper. Now with yellow, you can see that yellow in this photo is really the highlights in his hair, and there's a slight highlight under his chin that helps define his chin a little bit more as I move the luminosity of yellow up into the lighter version of yellow there. So that's about what I'm going to do with Topaz Clarity, and now I'm going to press OK. Then there's the awkward pause. Okay, there we go. All right, again, I've got my working copy and I've got my history underneath, so I'm still good to go. I can still start moving with this. And this is where Topaz Impression comes in. Now, as you saw before, the background that he was on was in my basement with an electrical outlet behind his head. Not a very attractive background for a good portrait. So that's where we have Topaz Impression coming in. And if you've ever been in a studio and you see that they have 15 to 20 different rolls of backdrops that they can roll out, some are painted, some have like a brick look, you don't necessarily have to have that in your studio anymore, especially with something like Topaz Impression. So what I'm going to do is actually open up a texture for this. And if you go to my website after this is all done, you'll see that you can download these textures. One of the things that I do when I'm out on a photo shoot is I shoot many textures. Every time I go on a photo shoot, it doesn't matter where I go, I shoot a texture. So I've got thousands upon thousands upon thousands of different colored textures in my photo bank that I can use at any time. I'm only giving you 10. Sorry, you can't have my thousands. But these 10 are very good to use in photos to get that nice background look. So if you see here, we got some clouds. You can put those clouds in the background and you can soften them up a little bit so that what you're getting here is kind of your own studio backdrops in a box. Okay, so if you haven't taught yourself that every time you go out you shoot a texture, I've got some for you. And typically with textures, I try to keep the aperture setting anywhere between 8 and something like 11 so that those textures don't have any bokeh in them. So if there's any ridges or ledges in those textures, like you see here in this wall, I even took this one at f14 so that I could make sure that the area that I was focusing on wasn't going to make the rest of the photograph blurry. And then you just try and get the best looking texture possible. You don't need to concern yourself too much with textures, with ensuring that they're crazy in focus or overly sharp, because that kind of stuff will distract, especially in this case, of how we're going to use this texture. So I'm going to just double click this texture, open it up, press V, and I'm going to drag that texture right into this image, and it's going to be really small, but that's okay because I can press Command or Control T. Now if you're wondering what this texture is, I'll tell you. We have a toaster oven, and on that toaster oven we wrap the little tray that comes with it with foil. And every once in a while the oils from whatever we're cooking in the toaster oven leak underneath that foil, and when you remove the foil and you're tempted to scrub that tray clean, I actually have an ongoing texture of this tray because this is the tray with the foil off of it, and it makes a beautiful texture. So you can think about that when you're looking at certain things and they look kind of grungy or have this certain look to them, they can be used very well as a texture. So there, if I just move it from my working copy, just move that right down, I can move it right below my history, you can see that now that layer is behind everything else. And this is where impression comes in. So everyone now, including myself, have been using Topaz Impression to make images look like paintings. And that's great. It's great that you can do that with a single click preset. But now what I want to do is challenge you and to think about using Topaz Impression in ways that you can use it as a tool to amplify your photographs rather than a means to an end. So instead of it being the end, you're using it as a means to an end. You're using it as a tool in your photographic style to get you to the end. I looked over at the comments, fasten your seatbelts impression. That's great. And you're using it as a tool to get yourself to the end product rather than the end product being impression. So I'm going to click on that background layer, go to Filter, go to Topaz Labs, and go to Topaz Impression. Let's hope my graphics card can handle it. All right, that was a joke. Sorry, Topaz. Okay, so now when I look at the image, I have multiple things that I can do with this. Basically what I'm trying to do here, looking at this is a color pencil preset that I had been using. Basically what I'm trying to do with this is select a preset that's going to set me up with a subtle background, a background that's not going to be overbearing because I don't want to distract from my foreground figure. So I'm going to scroll down here, go down to impression, and the impressionistic settings are they're my favorite. So I like this one a lot. I'm going to start with this one, and I'm going to open up my settings. Now for the brush size, I'm going to go really large. I'm going to go as large as I can make it. Now paint volume. The paint volume is going to adjust just how thick those strokes are. Now if you've ever seen a Van Gogh in person in a museum, you can see that there's highlights and shadows on his individual strokes because there's no reason. I wonder why he was thinking why he was broke, because paint is expensive. No matter what time period you're in, paint is expensive. And here he's using these thick globs of paint to paint his pictures. The beauty of it came in that you get these highlights and these pits, these highlights and shadows in the individual textures. That's what the paint volume is going to do. Now, for a painting, I would say go ahead and go with that. But for a background to a photo, I'm going to drop the paint volume down quite a bit. Maybe not all the way down, but down just enough so that it's not quite getting those pits and distractions in my background. So then I can go to the paint opacity here, and the paint opacity is going to, if I drop it all the way down, it's going to start to show more of my background through the paint. I'll still get a painterly look because there's the before, here's the after, but I don't quite get that that full-on paint stroke effect. But I kind of want that, especially in this photograph. So I'm going to bring the paint opacity up to about 0.3. So then the stroke width. The stroke width is just how thick those strokes are on the thickness of the brush. So it's kind of how wide you went with the brush stroke itself rather than the brush size itself. So I'm bringing that stroke width up quite a bit here, and then I'll look at the stroke length. Now the stroke length, if I bring it all the way down, you get these short, choppy strokes, almost like it should be like the colored pencil look, but I'm still going for that painterly look. So I'll bring the stroke length up a little bit, and I kind of want this to blend a little bit more, so I'll bring that stroke length up quite a bit. The spill is going to adjust just how much of that paint creates from the texture or spills into the different lines or textures that are in this photograph, and there's not a whole lot of actual line work here, so you can see it's kind of just taking some of that underlying color and it's adding that to the photograph. So I'm going to bring the spill up a little bit here. That'll be good. So I still get some of that definition from underneath, because if I bring it all the way down, I don't get the definition from, I get too much definition from those underlying details. So I want to kind of just spill that over those details a little bit. Now with the smudge is going to help kind of manipulate that paint so that it's not a definitive stroke. So if I move the smudge up a little bit, you'll start to see how the paint starts to get a very mild smudge look across the paint. Of course, you have the color settings here too. So if I wanted to adjust the colors in these individual areas of this color, it's predominantly orange and yellow anyway. So moving into something like my greens and my yellows or my greens and my blues isn't really going to help. But I could adjust the hue, the saturation, and all that of these individual colors. Let's go into the saturation of yellow. So if I move the saturation up in yellow, you can see that it's just moving the saturation up in anywhere that the color yellow is. So I'm going to move the lightness up a little bit, especially because in that picture, I want there to be some white right behind my focal point or the subject. All right, so here's the before and here's the after. I've made a nice painterly looking effect that can be used almost like a backdrop in a photographer's studio. So when I press OK, there we go. We have our painted background that was from, what did I say this was before? A tray from a toaster oven is now the background of my photo that's really helping amplify this image. Now, my style, as opposed to what your style would be. How do I know what color of a texture to use in the background? That is up to the individual. Now, I know that yellow and blue are opposites on the color wheel. So anytime you use yellow and blue together, they're going to help the overall composition of the photo because of their complementary color aspects and how they play off of each other. That's why I chose yellow. Now, another thing I need to do here, though, is create a new layer. And with that new layer, what I want to do is get a brush, a very large brush and a very white brush. Now you see here, if we were in a studio or something, our background would change based off of the lighting that we used. Now you can see here, there's a very strong white area here. That's where the light was hitting the most. That's where it hit the most on the side of his face here. So if I go to my brush tool and I select white, now D is the default to get you to white and black. So if you had like green and blue in here and you press D, D is going to default you to black and white. And then if you press X, that's going to switch from black to white. Those are just clever things to know in Photoshop to speed up your workflow. So now I'm going to click. I'm going to click right behind him here and make this side white. And maybe that last one was a little too much. That's perfect right there. I don't want it to be overly white because that's unrealistic. We know that light doesn't necessarily wash out our background unless we put it right on our background. So I'm going to drop that opacity a little bit so that it just slightly blends and blurs my background into my foreground a little bit so that that lighting situation looks like it should have existed. Now, on the other side of that, I need to do black on this side. So I'm going to press X, and I'm going to click black, and I'm going to paint a little bit of black on this side. Now, that's obviously too much, so I'll just drop the opacity on there quite a bit so that now our background looks like it should be with our subject and have them both go together. So with all that done, now we can put the polish on this. And before I go into that, what I see here is eyes. Now, eyes are the key to your subject. A striking portrait is going to capture someone when those eyes are meeting the viewer the most. So what I like to do with eyes is open up a new layer that's a curves adjustment layer. So I went down here to my adjustments and open up curves. And what I'm going to do is actually bring that curve up until those eyes start to look white. Now, what that curve is doing is it's affecting my entire image, which that doesn't look good. So I'm going to just press Command or Control I on that mask there so it makes it all black. So now there's no effect. So if I zoom into those eyes, and again, I'm going to press that / key that's right next to the right bracket key, and that's going to make everything look red. Now, if I use my brush and I get to a very small brush that is white, I can now resurrect those areas that I used in the curves adjustment layer in just the eyes. Now, I'm using a Wacom tablet, and a Wacom tablet is pressure sensitive, so it knows exactly what I want the most to be in because my pen gets to decide how much pressure goes into the overall look of what it is that I want. So now, if I remove that quick mask, you can see that I have clear definition in the eyes. Now, one thing that happens there, though, is that the eyes start to look like they're piercing through you, and that is not natural. So what I'm going to do is actually go to that curve layer there and click on that and go into its individual properties and move the feathering up. So now if you see what happens here with the properties, oops, I accidentally deleted it. If you can see what happens here with the properties of that feather when I have the quick mask selected, if I move that feather up, you can see how it starts to blend in the adjustment with the eyes because it's feathering in that mask, and that's perfect. That's exactly what I want. What I don't want, though, is my black eyes, the pupil of the eye, to turn into this, like, I used a filter on it. So what I'm going to do is actually just go in and use black and just click right there in the pupil of the eye so that the actual pupil is not affected now. Okay, and then remove that quick mask. So there's the before and after on those eyes. That will help boost your eyes without making them look overly, too much. And it's the same thing we're doing with skin. You don't want to boost that too much. So I'm going to drop the opacity a little bit on there so that it's still. I like to make things subtle. You know, if you ever see my HDR work, I usually try to go with a subtle HDR effect. If you saw my old HDR work, that doesn't count. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is press Control, Shift, Alt, and E, and that's going to make a stamp. Now I've got a background and I've got a foreground. The problem with a background and a foreground being together is that the color temperatures are different. The color temperatures are clearly different because the texture, the toaster oven pan, I couldn't really put behind my son's head, especially at that size. So now I need to get those color temperatures to match, and that is where Restyle comes in to set this all off. Restyle is a great finishing touch for what's called color grading. And color grading is something that's used in the film industry quite a bit. If you've ever seen movies like 300, I think I was even watching Twilight. Don't make fun of me. I was watching Twilight with my wife the other night, and there's like this cyanish color over them when they're in the when they met for the first time in the classroom. I remember colors. I don't remember the movie. I can't even tell you their names, but I'm definitely Team Jacob. So anyway, the preset that I'm going to use here is going to be something that's going to help boost the contrast in this photo. So I'll go with that tan and phthalo green. It's one of my favorites. It's actually found in the portrait section here. It's tan and phthalo green right here, and the portrait section, I've already favorited it, so I'll click that one. Now the thing about color grading is that you don't want to use one of these presets from Restyle just right on top of the image. I would say almost 90% of the time it's too much, unless you're trying to go for an overly dramatic look. That's where we go over here and go to opacity, drop the opacity to about 30%, and then go into soft light. So now you can see I've made my color temperatures match because I've added a color grade over both my background and my foreground, and that right there defines my style and how I use the Topaz products to create my style when I'm working with my portraiture. But again, if you have any takeaway from this, the takeaway should be that you should not ever wish that your style was somebody else's, because your style is yours. It's unique to you, and only you own your style. Don't get frustrated in the early times in your photographic career where you don't know where your style fits in, because it's going to take time. And like I said, when you transition out of the how did Blake do that and into the oh, I know why Blake did that, then you're starting to transition into how and why you're going to be using that stuff in your photographic style. And now we can go ahead and open up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was great. We have some questions coming through.
Awesome.
Let's see. We had a few people ask why you save your textures as JPEGs rather than RAW or TIFF files.
I had them saved as JPEGs in the texture folder for ease of transport, because if I made those raw images and gave those all out as raw images, they would be huge, and it would be like a 1 gig download, and I didn't want to make anyone have to download something for a gig, so I just gave high-res JPEGs. Usually I work in RAWs so that when I open up a texture in Camera Raw, I can modify that texture for how I want it to look when I'm putting it in my photo.
Okay. Susan asks, Blake is talking about style, which I've been trying to figure out in my photographic journey. I've been told I need to limit my subject matter to 4. I photograph so many things, but I like various things too. In order to have a style, do you need to keep your subject matter limited, like people who only photograph wild horses, architecture, etc.?
Oh, my answer to this question is probably going to be pretty liberal. And the reason why I say this is because I got a degree in printmaking and sculpture, but beforehand I was a painter, and even after I graduated I went back to painting, and now I'm a photographer. So I think what I always tell everyone, whether it's in your personal life or it's in your photographic career, you are your own limitation. If you already have other people that are allowing you, that are limiting you, that are trying to limit you, and you let them limit you, then you're your own limitation. Now, with that being said, does that mean tomorrow go out and photograph everything? No, not at all, because you need to have a refined style in those areas that you work. Now, if you see my HDR photographs and you see my portrait photographs, they are 2 totally different styles, and it's taken me forever to get to that point. But here's what they say. They say that to become an expert at anything, all you need to do is apply 10 years or 10,000 hours to it. So if you apply 10,000 hours to portrait photography, 10,000 hours to landscape photography, 10,000 hours to architecture photography, or any amount in between, you are slowly becoming an expert at all of those different areas. So my advice is never limit yourself, and more importantly, never allow someone else to limit you, because that is more pointless than limiting yourself. And that might be a little too philosophical, or way over the edge, but that's how I live my life, period, is there are no limitations. One day I could be jumping out of airplanes, the next minute I'm on the ground taking pictures. You don't limit yourself. If you limit yourself, you're ultimately going to stop there and only be a landscape photographer or only be an architecture photographer, and there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you specialize in. But what I'd like to do is actually get myself to a point where I've got a photographic style in everything. And there are going to be certain things from your HDR photography or your landscape photography that are going to spill into other avenues of your photography. And that's fine. You just open up and you embrace that.
Great answer. Let's see. We have Joe asks, why are you not using smart filters when using multiple filters on a single layer? Is there a preference or?
You can use smart filters, and it's actually a good idea to use smart filters, especially when you're working on an image like this. It's well in depth. A lot of times I don't incorporate that into my webinar workflow, and the reason being is that it sometimes slows things down, and that smart filters are pretty advanced as far as workflow is concerned, and the minute you start incorporating smart filters, you lose a lot of people. So I wouldn't say it's a cop-out because I'm doing a webinar, but the reason is a lot of times I don't use smart filters unless if I'm experimenting a lot on an image, I'll use smart filters. For this, before I do a webinar, I practice on the image, so I know exactly what I'm going to apply to it because I practiced it. So I don't necessarily need to use a smart object workflow. But if I'm doing this in a professional aspect, I will use smart filters, and that is a good thing to point out to people, is that smart filters are good to incorporate in your workflow. So that you can always go back. And for those who don't know what a smart filter is basically on that working copy right here. If I were to if I were to have made this, if I were to right click and made this a smart object from the very beginning, and where are you? I don't think I can have these linked. If I do, let me see that. If I were to make this a smart object here, convert to smart object, and then as I was using filters, you would see them stacked underneath, and then I could always go back. So if I got to this point and I didn't like the reflector that I had used, I could always go back and edit that reflector in Topaz Lens Effects without having to go all the way back to that portion. So it's a super non-destructive way to edit your photographs, and it is a good idea to use that.
Great. Donald asks, if you're using your digital zone system, would you still use Topaz Clarity with that? Is there a time to use both?
Yes, I would use both, and a lot of times what you can do with something like Topaz Clarity, if I'm using that in my workflow, a lot of times I'm talking about, especially here, I'm talking about the hows and whys. Now, how you boost your contrast is up to you. Why I use Clarity in this is because it was really quick and it was really simple, and it didn't require too much of a contrast adjustment. I could have used the digital zone system in place of Topaz Clarity because the digital zone system would have given me 11 points of contrast to adjust, whereas Topaz Clarity gives me more of that 4-point adjustment with the blacks, whites, and so on. But you can use them both because you could use Topaz Clarity to boost the initial contrast and then run the digital zone system on top of that, which would pull from a more defined area. So if I were to boost the contrast in this photograph using Topaz Clarity to get more definitive highlights and shadows, when I ran the digital zone system, it would get a better separation of highlight and shadow.
Let's see. Carrie asks, would the lens effects filter reflector work on a black and white image as well for the lighting effect on a shadow of the face?
Let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and find out right now. Let's go into lens effects and see. I don't know the answer to that question, so we're going to find out real quick. Reflector, yep, it still works.
Cool.
So you can boost that strength up a little bit, and then you can move it. That actually looks kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
She's developing her style already. Look at that. Okay.
All right.
So it does. Yeah, there's the answer.
Yeah, that's cool. Let's see. Carrie also asked if you're using the stylus or art pen Wacom tablet, because she said there's differences.
I use a Wacom bamboo tablet that I bought probably 7 years ago. It's really small. but it gets the job done. I think there's only like 400 points of pressure on it, whereas the new ones have like 2,500 points of pressure. But when it comes to a Wacom tablet, my take on it is that if you're just going to be retouching photos and you're not necessarily doing digital painting would require one of the higher end tablets. But for my purposes and what I use it for, a cheap Wacom tablet that gets the job done will do just that. I don't use anything fancy.
Mandy asks, what format do you save your images in? JPEG, TIFF, PNG?
I save in multiple ways. If I was going to post this to the web, I would save it as a JPEG. It depends on what I'm saving it for. But I usually keep the raw image. I don't ever get rid of the raw images. And then once I transition from Camera Raw to Photoshop, I ensure that I'm running in 16 bits so that when I'm operating on it, I save everything as a 16-bit TIFF. And then once I'm done with that 16-bit TIFF and I like it, I'll probably save all of the layers as a file, and then I'll also save it as a flattened TIFF, and I'll also save it as a flattened JPEG. That's high res and low res. So for every photograph that I run through, I'll probably save it 5 or 6 times for different purposes. So I have the TIFF with all of that valuable information. I have the unedited raw photo. I also have the layers. So if I ever need to go back, because here's the deal. I told you that style evolves. Well, guess what? 5 years from now, my style is going to be totally different. And I embrace that. I think it's awesome. So I can go back to those layered photos, and I can make any modifications that I need to, if I needed to. So I save it in multiple different ways.
Awesome. Well, I think that's the end of our questions for today. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think everyone's really seemed to enjoy it.